welcome back to the Healthtech Pigeon podcast, brought to you by SomX. I'm Jessica, and this week I am joined, as always, by the brilliant producer Adama and my colleagues James and Belle. Welcome, everybody. Hi.
Hello.
Well, it has been quite a week for us over at SomX. I would say that the festive Thanksgiving event season is well and truly in swing. And, we have been in London a lot this week. Where have we been, James?
We're Jack Reinler's Leaders in Health Summit, which was, that's one of the events where it definitely feels like, we're punching up a little bit, because you go into the room and there's just, you look at the agenda and it's like Tony Fadell, the guy who is widely credited to have invented the iPod and the iPhone, was there giving a keynote. You've got people literally developing like world-changing biotech companies, health tech companies. Yeah, just a collection of like the coolest people in one room. So it was awesome. It was a lot of fun. Jessica, you and I obviously chaired a panel which was a debate on, and by the way, love that format. We've talked about this for a little while, like putting together a debates evening.
So good, yeah.
But like this definitely proved it was like a nice little testing ground for us to test being debate moderators. But I think it's a fantastic format where, you have that sort of call. People listening, like, you'll know, like when you're on panels and stuff, you have a call beforehand where you talk about like what are you going to say, and everyone sort of says points, and everyone goes, well, I agree, and I agree, and I agree. This is like wildly different to that, because you get on the call beforehand and you've got people picked obviously because they appreciate both sides of the argument but have already thought about it and have a stance. So already you've got very informed people around an argument. And so ours was around clinical trials, and basically what should be gold standard. Should it be randomized control trials, or should it be adaptive trials? And the premise was that RCTs are economically unviable. And that was the sort of bold statement that people were either defending or attacking. And so it was a setting and a format that just meant that you had these really interesting arguments presented on both sides. And unlike a panel where everyone sort of sanitizes what they say to sort of be in the middle, it's a format that intentionally gets everyone to really polarize themselves one way or another. And it was really interesting because, not to spoil it, because there'll be an executive summary coming out and like all of that sort of stuff from the Leaders in Health team and Jack Reinler's team and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it was really nice because at the end of it, everyone shakes hands and sort of declares where they actually are on it. And of course, the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. But whilst the truth does lie somewhere in the middle, actually, there are still extremes of truth around minutiae of the argument. So rather than it being like, oh, well, the truth is that both are applicable and the truth is actually that this is applicable here, this should be applicable here, we should actually be a lot more accepting of this in this scenario, and actually, yes, it is unviable in this scenario because for these reasons. And so awesome panel, really awesome debate, really enjoyed it. And I think that is one step closer to us putting together a regular SomX debates evening where we're debating the most contentious issues in health tech, and then just picking out who we already know are the most contentious individuals in the sector to do so. So that will be very fun. So that was the Leaders in Health event, and yeah, just broadly, very great collection of individuals. Even in the breaks and stuff, just awesome conversations with people, and very well curated group of individuals. So really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think the real triumph was that James and I both survived co-chairing our first debate together, and neither of us threw chairs at each other, which I think set a suitable tone for the rest of the room. But all joking aside, one of the things I actually really liked was the intimacy of the debate that we had, which meant that not only did we have, as James said, really informed and passionate, energetic debate and argument from the panel and debate teams themselves, but the rest of the room were able to get involved in that, and bringing in those extra views, I think, really added flavour and dimension to the conversation. Albeit I got a bit frustrated because I was like, those are the questions I wanted to ask. You took my question. But it was just very cool being able to hear from a much wider spectrum of people than your usual, a couple of people on stage, kind of sharing a perspective, which is, great when it's done really well. But there's something very special about being able to bring people into that conversation, and it not be kind of us and them, but actually a collaborative experience together. So I really, really enjoyed that. And I've said this a couple of times, but I think credit to Jack and to Vernon as well from Havas for putting on a fantastic event. And I think Jack really does have such a gift for bringing together some incredible people, brilliant minds who have done phenomenal things that also make you feel very small but humbled to kind of be sharing space with them. Yeah, it's just a very special event, I think, in the year that we definitely look forward to. And it's often nice as well because it's not centered on lots of things we are talking about day to day and lots of the challenges we're seeing that exist that need to be solved right now, but actually it is that, it sounds corny, it's that future thinking and like visionary ideas that can get you as fired up as solving a problem that's actually going to change someone's life today, tomorrow. So I really appreciated that of the day.
I do have quite a funny story on this, by the way, because there's like an afternoon break, and Tony Fadell's talk was last. Well, it was a one-to-one interview with Jack interviewing Tony Fadell, right? And again, I will repeat this: like, he invented the incredibly world-changing like devices, the iPod and the iPhone. And in the afternoon break, Jack was just ferrying people into rooms and just moving the whole thing along. And clearly he'd had a day of it, because you do when you're running an event, you're quite tired. And he just came up to me and just sort of, he put his arm around me and just sort of collapsed into me a little bit and just said, like, "Oh mate, I might be a little bit too tired to do this final interview with Tony. So you've got a podcast, so and Tony should definitely be on your podcast, by the way. But yeah, I think I might just get you to do the interview last if I'm feeling a bit tired." My heart rate all of a sudden now goes to like 220, because I'm like, you're now potentially going to put me into an interview with like this guy who I've like read loads about and know about already in a massive way. And like, okay, interesting. So I'm then like, for the rest of the afternoon, just can't concentrate on anything because I'm like...
James literally didn't eat all day because he was so stressed about it.
I couldn't eat because I'm like, oh my God, I might interview Tony Fadell. This is like simultaneously amazing and like incredibly petrifying. So then I couldn't eat lunch. And then and then I'm like thinking of questions, thinking like, what's the angle here? Haven't done any prep, haven't spoken to him before, haven't got a rapport. How am I going to do that quickly? I'm thinking about all this sort of stuff. And then I'm like very tentatively hanging at the back of the room, just thinking like, it's quite conceivable that Jack could get onto stage and then say, by the way, we're just going to get James to interview you.
Yeah, that's the thing with Jack, though, isn't it? You just never know. It's always a surprise.
So, yeah, fortunately, I did not have to do that interview, so
imagine
I could just sit back and enjoy it.
One of the biggest interviews, and your stomach just rumbled. Hadn't eaten enough.
Sorry, I'm just nervous and hungry.
And that's also a look behind the curtain of like someone with a podcast with 400 episodes. You probably don't get nervous anymore before interviews. No, that's not true. You absolutely do. When it might just be the biggest person you've ever interviewed. So and that was just one of the events that we had last week.
It was just one of the events. So on Wednesday, we also hosted our Healthtech Talks Christmas party with Google Cloud. I definitely over-egged the festivity. I think in that I was encouraging people to wear Christmas jumpers and bring the festive vibes, and I brought none of those myself. We did have festive pizza and we did have festive drinks. But I forgot the Christmas tree. I didn't manage to bring any decorations. But do you know what? It was such a good evening. We like to get in early, I think, in the calendar, because December just gets hectic. But as always, amazing collaboration with Google Cloud, and just celebrating some of those big conversations and all the community moments that we had together over the last year. And so I think, we had about 200 people turn out. And we did a potluck panel, which was our very first time trying something like that, which really was just opening it up to the floor. And again, I really enjoyed that, because it was nice to just hear from lots of different people, and people who are kind of volunteering their thoughts, rather than just waiting to a Q&A at the end of a panel. So we opened up to ask people what their highlights of 2024 were and their predictions for 2025. And a beautiful moment of serendipity where Abena from Medic Footprints was telling us about how she did couch to 21k in 6 weeks. And then
genuinely mind-boggling.
Absolutely mind-boggling. Like, how? I think probably the fact that the ultimate goal was the half marathon, and she was doing it in Malta. I think it was Malta, somewhere nice anyway. Was decent motivation. She says it was the medal. I think it was the sun. But then that was immediately followed up by one of the product managers from Couch to 5K, which was just truly remarkable. I did have to chivvy the audience up to make sure that we didn't leave out large language models and generative AI. Surprisingly, it took us a few people before we got there for the things that we were most excited about. But we covered a decent amount of ground. Obviously, women's health, we covered health equity, we covered generative AI, all the big ones that we love talking about. But it was just, really, really nice to have a good group of people in the room, and just enjoy our time together before we launch into the next 12 months and close out the year on a high. So thank you to everyone who joined us, and looking forward to seeing you all next year. And then what did we do yesterday? SomX Team Day. Obviously, fantastic.
Of course,
massive highlight. Bringing the team together as always. Again, getting Christmas in early, and meeting a few members of the team. Obviously, good food, and then closing out the day with some forced fun at Taskmaster Live.
I was so full by the time I got to the train station. I was like, I'm going to need to buy a sandwich for the train because I don't go home till midnight. But I was so full. I was just sort of kind of paralysed in the sandwich section. Like, what do I eat? That lunch was amazing.
It was a great lunch, and producer Adma was responsible for that recommendation. So she's not just a talent on the airwaves. She can hook you up with a good culinary recommendation. So if anyone needs that, you know where to go.
The Taskmaster thing was quite funny. Obviously, Jess, you couldn't come in, but the first task, James was convinced until the end that he'd won it and was absolutely livid.
I was so convinced. I was so convinced. You basically had to guess, you had to guess the lowest unique number of the group. So anyone in the group can say any number. You just have to say the lowest unique number between 1 and 10. And I just guessed 1 because no one was going to guess 1 because no one's going to get someone guess 1, obviously. So.
But it was coming around. You could just see James just being like, yes, I absolutely nailed this.
Yeah, exactly. And then the last but one person, had guessed 1. He's just like, what are you playing at? It was Amy in the SomX team as well. I was just like,
where's her team sportsmanship?
Exactly. It's not the way to come in and impress, is it? But let's talk about some health tech, shall we? Before everyone turns off.
Yeah, right. Let's talk about some news. And it's also my last week in the news studio. So my brain's not really working, so I'm going to let you guys do the talking. But let's kick off with our first story, which is suitably about AI. And this time, featured in Digital Health, is an AI tool that could identify people who are at risk of type 2 diabetes 10 years in advance of actually being diagnosed with the condition. Now, it's worth saying this is a tool that is at research stage. The research was funded by the British Heart Foundation and the NIHR, and it's conducted at Imperial College London. and the tool is called the AI ECG Risk Estimation for Diabetes Mellitus, also known as AIR-DM tool. That's not the most interesting thing about it, though. The most interesting thing, from my point of view, certainly, was that the tool and the algorithm was built using 1.2 million ECGs from hospital records, which works accessed via the UK Biobank. And that actually, interestingly, kind of resonated with me because it linked to a conversation I had earlier in the week at, I think it was at the Christmas party, where someone actually was talking about how data is going to be such an important part of next year, and we're going to shift our focus from AI to data, and the value of these data banks like the UK Biobank in really progressing health innovation and how we better diagnose people and support people through their care. So that was a lovely synergy, as another one, as I say. But basically, what they used that data for was to validate the algorithm's ability to detect really subtle changes in the ECG years before there was any hint of increase in blood sugar levels where these people might be at risk. So it sounds like the intention is that for next year, they will be undergoing prospective clinical studies alongside some further research on a similar tool, also exploring, I think it was heart failure, but cardiovascular disease as well. So, you know, obviously super early days, very much in its infancy and research phase. There's a lot of hurdles to jump over, but imagine being able to identify these predictors 10 years before you even came close to having that condition. James, why are you excited about this story?
Because if you put me in a room with someone for an hour 10 years before they have diabetes and just give me 10 questions to ask them, I can predict with pretty good accuracy who's going to have diabetes in 10 years time.
You use an AI tool, eh?
So who needs an AI tool? Because if you've got the, I mean, like that. So not that I'm anti-tech and not that I'm anti how good, you know, the science is behind this and the research, but like, I'd like to see the difference between just a GP in a room with someone versus this tool, and then measure at 10 years that entire population in both camps and just see if there's any difference at all. Because what you're basically saying is people have started to show ECG changes. So you've started to get some sort of cardiac change. So some change is going on in the heart, which means that in 10 years, you're likely to have diabetes. Now, that's going to be a mixture of genetics and lifestyle, isn't it? So it's interesting to me that what this kind of points to what I've been saying for a while, that in terms of like an AI strategy in healthcare, we're lacking and we're throwing everything at the wall. Now, that's okay, because in a research setting, we do, I guess, want to research lots of different things. It's good that we can learn that there are ECG changes. It's good that we can correlate those ECG changes to things later down the line. For everything, that's going to teach us about everything in healthcare and things downstream of that. But if you're looking at this strategically in terms of, let's isolate this. Let's isolate this and go, do we want to learn about ECG changes that can predate type 2 diabetes by 10 years? What's the cost of learning that specifically versus, I don't know, throwing things out there, genetically testing everyone at birth early on their way to diabetes or whatever, and then looking at their lifestyle? Or indeed, just looking at their lifestyle and their BMI, or, you know, whatever, however you want to measure, like, you know, weight and fat and coronary disease and the rest of it. So, like, I'm not sure that, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure what the benefit of this is, because it doesn't really go into that in this detail. And I think that's the thing with this type of thing. It's like an isolated, yeah, we've just learned about ECG changes potentially that could spot type 2 diabetes in 10 years. Well, that's also going to be associated with a lot of lifestyle stuff over that 10 years, or it's going to be genetic. So realistically, you could just test everyone's genetics and then make sure everyone lives a decent lifestyle. You wouldn't need this. And this is what I'm saying about, like, as a country, as a world, as a technology or health tech community, I think it's worth us looking and thinking deeply about what route do we want to go down here? Do we want to go down a route of mass genetic testing at birth and that being a thing? Or do we think that restricts freedoms, everyone knowing exactly everything about what their health could be? Or do we think that's a good thing? Do we want to just talk about lifestyle? Like, there's a strategy here which renders a lot of the research that we're doing, like, not irrelevant, but less important. And if we focus on what we want to actually achieve and direct resource really aggressively at the lower hanging fruit, or the things that we think are going to make the most impact, I think there's a lot that could be done so that researchers that are able to do incredible work like this are pointed at what could be adopted very quickly. Because I'm just not convinced where this fits in any sort of clinical pathway or indeed the future. It might just be nice research, or indeed it might be incredible and it might be going towards something that's adoption worthy. I just don't know that from this article, but that's not, and by the way, just to conclude, it's not me saying that this is bad research, great research. It's incredible what we're learning here. Like, it really is. Like, anyone doing research on correlating something that we can learn in health tech versus how that appears in patients, like, fantastic. Like, I'm sure there's loads that we'll learn from this downstream. I'm just so focused on, like, could we direct resource on researching AI to where we can adopt things quickly and make change? So, yeah, I'm not sure.
I think there's lots of, like, interesting things there for me. And I think, first of all, the immediate thing that comes to mind when you say, yes, we could screen everyone genetically at birth and we could make sure that we have this great database of what people are predisposed to. But when it comes to lifestyle factors and measuring that, it's not actually that easy. It often relies on people reporting certain things, being truthful to themselves and to their clinician as well, which is a bigger thing. And also, you know, I might not really realize if my lifestyle's good or bad or somewhere in the middle, because I'm a normal person and not a clinician or someone that can speak to what is good and what is not. Again, if you're someone very tech-driven or very active, then you're going to have a much more acute awareness of your lifestyle risks and where you can improve it to someone that doesn't. So I think something like this, and it's not to say that measuring the heart is going to be the best indicator, but it's an indicator which is bedded in data, and someone can go in, get an ECG scan, and then off the back of that, there is an output, and it doesn't rely on them having conversations, journaling, having to track their activity, having to really think about what they're eating or consuming and that sort of stuff. So it feels like an easier ask of people. I also think more broadly, there's an interesting thing here where we're starting to use data and technology to look at these silent diseases, so diseases that aren't typically diagnosed until they're either in their later stages because they're not manifesting in any physical symptoms, things like liver disease, which often isn't caught till really late, or these things where, yes, it might not be manifest now, but you've clearly got risk factors if there's something measurable at this point. I think that's fascinating, and I think the ongoing movement towards preventative healthcare is a really important one here, where we're thinking, all right, well, actually, you might not have that yet, or you might be at such an early stage that you're way off getting a diagnosis the traditional route, but we can use data and AI to help us make better decisions and predictions on your health outcomes in the future. I also think as a resource for scientists, for researchers, and ultimately for clinicians and things, they're saying they can catch diabetes 10 years earlier. That means at some point in time, there's going to be 10 years of longitudinal data on someone's ECG scans. And at that point in time, can we then tie diabetes as risk factors to other diseases? Or can we tie ECG scans to risk factors to other diseases? There's so much that could come out of this beyond just diabetes, because that's what they're aware of now is a link. And I think it's only a good thing that we're taking data over time and trying to really, really in depth look into that and say, what are the health implications of this? How does that tie to disease or diseases? And how can we help people more holistically with their health in the future as well? So whilst I totally understand you could be thrown into a room and ask some questions and say, I think you've got diabetes, there's lots of other things that I think in 10 years' time, the ECG might at that point be able to say, oh, this actually also pointed to you potentially being at risk of liver disease, say, just for the sake, I've already used that phrase. And that might be something which you'd find harder to catch asking behavioural or lifestyle questions 10 years in advance. So that's kind of what it brings to me. Yes, there are things we can do, and there's definitely ways clinicians and AI and data researchers can work closely to interrogate that data and make sure we're learning good things. But if we can get 10 years of data to allow us to make those learnings and decisions, I think we're on a really good track.
So I think that's very true. I think also, even just looking at costs, right? Like putting a doctor in a room with someone for an hour is incredibly expensive. Whereas if you've got incidental ECG data and you're able to just pick those types of things up, you're right. By the time you've then added that into a constellation of, data and signs and all that sort of stuff, like, yes, what you can infer from that starts to get really interesting and exciting. And just on that sort of incidentally picking things up as well, I think ECGs are just one of those things that, if you haven't had an ECG, you don't know what it is. Like, you're literally just going to put electrodes on the skin. It's going to pick up electrical conduction of the heart, and it's going to provide a trace. And based on what that trace looks like, you can pick up certain things. So if a part of the heart muscle is dead after like a heart attack or something where, the blood supply has been occluded, you will notice certain changes because electricity is basically just measured as it runs through the heart. So if it runs through an area with dead muscle, it will look slightly different in the reading and that kind of thing. And so people have those types of scans relatively regularly if you're talking in sort of healthcare terms. Like if you turn up to A&E with any sort of chest pain or any sort of stuff, like you'll get it for lots of different reasons. And so people can accumulate quite a lot of ECGs over time. And so especially if someone's struggling to get diagnosed for something, or they're having dizziness, or like any of these types of things, you can get ECGs for lots of different reasons is what I'm saying. And so, it's not as if this research has been done on a test that's like weird and wonderful and never been used. It's like you're actually trying to, whilst, I'm trying to be, relatively humorous in like for my opening gambit. I think, yeah, to your point, Belle, I think it's a test that's done so frequently that if you're able to pick up incidental findings that can lead to a certain preventative thing, like, type 2 diabetes or whatever, I think that's only positive because, again, I liked your point about people can not seem like they're going to get type 2 diabetes because of something that's not being reported or data that's not finding its way into the system, like diet. Because you can be, you can have a not very high BMI, have an incredibly terrible diet, and be accumulating coronary disease like there's no tomorrow because of a mixture of your genetics and that diet and things like that. So, yeah, I do think there's clearly a place for it. But I still just lean on this thing, though, of like, I love research like this, but the connection between this and how it reaches a clinical pathway still goes wanting for me. And I think if we were to define what we wanted from AI, and then we built against that with a view to it getting adopted very quickly, I just don't want stuff like this sitting on the shelf because then it's wasted effort.
I think that's an interesting point because we actually also often talk about the fact that we get too caught up in the technology, and maybe it's not even necessarily about defining what we want from AI, but it's actually about what are the problems that we're looking to solve and what are the solutions and where does this factor in. And so I think it's even, perhaps going above that. But a few things that I wanted to just pull on that each of you covered there. And first of all, I did not expect James to come out the blocks quite that hard on this. So there you go. You get, this is a true and honest view I mean, like true reactions
There was
from people.
definitely like a thinking fast and slow moment there.
And again, linking back to the top of the episode, we enjoy a debate here, and all perspectives are welcome. But James, you're talking there about, give me an hour in a room, and I could probably predict it. And I'm paraphrasing. Don't get me wrong, but I think there's a few things there that, as you said, Belle, diabetes can also be a predictor of other conditions. I think type 2 diabetes in particular, we know that the scale of the issue and that's only going to get worse. You mentioned things like BMI, James, as well. We know that BMI is not necessarily an accurate measure of health, and that's also something that can be explained away easily if you want to, if that's where you're at. And I think that there's been a big conversation about that metric in particular, but others like it, in terms of how reliable it is. But ultimately, there not really being anything else that we have to lean on from a quantifiable perspective. And I think that in itself links to something around this idea of behaviour change and lifestyle factors, where, again, I think globally, I don't think this is just us here in the UK, but I think behaviour change is one of the things that in healthcare we struggle with the most, because it so often means that the responsibility comes back to the individual, and their desire to want to make that change rather than some kind of intervention, for example. And there's been so much conversation, and there's lots of solutions out there who are working really hard to drive positive behaviour change. But I think there's so much behaviour change and lifestyle change is so complex. It's just not super straightforward. And I think as an individual, you have to really want that. And so I think there is value in having this much more accurate and quantifiable data point that a clinician can point to in a conversation with a person to support a discussion about how to make that change and why they need to be doing it and how that can look. So I think that there's something interesting there from the a new metric that we have available to us. We know that preventative healthcare is really important, but again, it's remained an elusive concept, I think, rather than something that is fundamentally baked into our health system. And we know that it's important, but we're too caught up on the sick care to be able to deal with the preventative care. And perhaps, again, having metrics like this can help us bridge into that earlier and start conversations earlier. And the other thing you mentioned was also about genetic testing. And when we were at the event on Tuesday, someone mentioned the NHS programme that's being rolled out at the moment with newborn babies across, I think it's about 20 hospitals in the UK, where you can enrol to have your child genetically tested, and that will follow them through life. And I don't know the exact specifics of the programme itself, but I guess it's to say that is starting to happen already. And even for James and I, we've had our baby genetically tested twice, not broad scale genetically tested, but genetically tested for certain conditions. And so for me, I guess that kind of initiative is the next step on from that. But I think you raise important questions about where do we go from there? How is it used, and what's the playbook there? How do we use that in the right way, and how do we get people, I guess, to have trust that it's being used in the right way? Because it can feel very matrix, that you've got that's a big decision to put your child's genetic data into a database that is going to exist probably infinitely, and how is that going to be used, and where is it going to be used? That's such intimate information that almost feels like it's being released into the wild. So the few things kind of baked in there. But for me, the big one is, is it the start of being able to shift the conversation with regards to BMI, and move conversations and hopefully action towards preventative health as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, isn't it, that I was in a call this morning with a client, and they mentioned that the 100,000 Genomes Project, which was our last big genetic testing of the UK population, is 22 years old now. It was completed in 2002. It's like mad, really. Like it's no longer the cutting edge, but that was really the last time we did this en masse, and people are still using the data from that to drive all sorts of incredible drug discovery and innovation.
And life looks so different now.
It's so different, exactly that. And again, to that point that was raised at the party on Wednesday, like the next wave, it's all about quality of data, and people are much more switched on as to, when people went into the 100,000 Genomes Project, they knew it was for this big research exercise or whatever. But now there's so many other avenues for which you can get your genetics tested. You can do it at your doctors. You can do it through a thing you get delivered through the post and you send it back. There's loads of different avenues for that. And people are much more switched on as to what they're happy for the data to be used for and not. So it is connecting everything and saying, yes, we're using this in order to get these better insights so that we can impact your healthcare in this way. And people don't just feel like it's this amorphous, well, what's going to happen with it? Because then the barriers go up and people don't want to be part of that story, which I think is vital. And thinking of like how that makes its way into the doctor's clinic, to your point, James, at the beginning, saying, I don't want this sitting on a shelf. Like, it's such a long story and there's so many parts of it. And it's fascinating. And we're lucky to work in this field and hear all these stories all the time. But it just opens so many questions that none of us really have the answers to.
I actually do worry if the answer becomes, we're going to genetically test everyone at birth and just give you like a risk stratification on pretty much everything you can think of at birth. And then that's just, yeah, it's like plenty of films and none of them seem to end well. So like I find it like a real attack on freedoms. Like I really do. Like, and I feel like it's in fact, one of the events we went to last week was the BMJ Future Health event. And I actually put a quote on the SomX LinkedIn about this against an image of the panel that said it. And the question, Sam Shah was the guy who asked the question to the panel after they'd been talking about something. And he said, in that case, do you think that technology is pushing the cognitive load onto patients? And I think that's a really interesting question, because as we talk about personal empowerment, as we talk about the person owning their own data, we talk about the person being the main advocate for their care, being the project manager of their own healthcare, handling all the data from all of their wearables, dealing with all of their referrals, doing all of this stuff. Like, the link between personal responsibility and actual just personal burden is like quite like that's quite interesting for me, because as we move from a very didactic, like, you go to, is that the right word? You go to the doctor tells you what to do. You can sort of surrender in that scenario. And I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong, but I'm saying like that at least there's an argument that's quite comforting in some ways, that you live your life how you live your life. You go and access healthcare when there's a problem and someone tells you what to do about it. Now, I know that ignores so much about, education and preventing the need for it in the first place. But I think there definitely is something about cognitive load, about having wearables pinging you all the time and nudging you or telling you what's right or wrong, or even and the extreme of that is then a genetic test at birth, which now just gives you a framework and a structure that you have to fit into, that you're never going to eat beef for the rest of your life because it's a bad thing to do, it's a naughty thing to do, or drinking alcohol or this or that, the other. And I don't know, like it's more of an ethical or philosophical question than anything else about is that the world that we want to live in? And therefore, a question then becomes, well, is it a world that most people want to live in? And if it is a world that most people want to live in, should everyone therefore have to live in it? There's just a lot the whole mass genetic testing thing. We've talked about it on Pigeon before, about this leads you up to things like genetic prejudice and groups forming, and like there's some real dystopian stuff that's associated with it, because there's a lot of cultural there's a lot of cultural phenomena that would occur in that scenario that we haven't really explored, other than in like Aldous Huxley explored it quite well, but a lot of books and films that if you want to end up like Brave New World, then maybe we could go down that route, but I certainly don't, at least now.
You know what, I think you mentioned earlier about putting together a debate series, and I think we potentially have just come up with the the first debate that we could perhaps be having about whether or not genetic testing for everyone is right, and what are the moral and ethical considerations. I think that's a debate I would definitely like to listen to, and I'm sure, James, you'll have a lot more to add from philosophical and even clinical perspectives. But our second news story is brought to us from Business Insider. Yeah, this is not necessarily an optimistic story. Headlined, many digital health companies are quietly raising down rounds and closing up shop. Now, the article talks about the fact that hundreds of healthcare startups have been struggling to raise since 2021. I think we can all vouch for the fact that that is the case. That is what we've seen. We had the boom back in 2020. And then we had a downturn since then. And I know that there was optimism coming into 2024 that we might see a little bit more of a buoyant investment landscape. And actually, my view was perhaps that we were starting to see some of that optimism come true towards the end of the year. But, what do I know? Maybe I'm wrong. And this article's right. They've got data. I don't. That was purely anecdotal from me. But what they're saying is that there are lots of startups that are cutting valuations essentially to become more appealing. A more appealing investment proposition to VCs. And others are quietly folding or looking for a quick, quiet buyout. Now, I think we talked previously about the fact that we've seen a fair few mergers and acquisitions, certainly over here in the UK, but also over in the US globally. In the past few months, we've definitely seen companies folding. If you want to hear more about that, I recommend listening to last week's episode with Forward Health, which was puns galore, and I had to mute myself on several occasions for laughing so much. I hope you found it as funny as I did. But in terms of numbers, what we're seeing is that in the first 3 quarters of 2021, we saw 729 healthcare startup investment deals to a value of a cool $29.1 billion. Now, in the equivalent period for 2024, so the first 3 quarters of 2024, we saw almost half that number of deals at 379, and a much, much smaller valuation of, I say only, it's still a big number, but comparatively, $8.2 billion. Now, that's data from Rock Health, which of course helps us tell a little bit of that story. But James, Belle, I'm keen to get your views on this. Do you think this is reflective of what we're actually seeing in practice?
I think it is. I think it definitely is reflective of what we're seeing. Obviously, we run a services business for health tech startups, biotech startups, and obviously diversifying into biotech has helped us ride quite a lot of bumps because that's been a bit more stable. But yeah, on the health tech side, like certainly, and I think the article talks about it, that the larger companies, the larger startups, the sort of Series B onwards, might be thinking about down rounds and different ways of exiting and that kind of thing. But actually, the seed and Series A are the ones that have been hit hardest because they are just packing up shop, folding into competitors without fanfare, I think is mentioned here. And yeah, also too, obviously thinking about down rounds and things. I think One thing that I do actually just want to pull out from this article, by the way, is what is probably the least relatable metaphor said by either an LP or a VC here is talking about how it's a bad vintage, it's done, move on, that's liberating. So what is a startup to a very wealthy institution, if not just a completely dispensable, slightly off bottle of wine, which is quite interesting. But I think this more talks to the funding model of venture capital in health tech, because my view of it is that if you want to start a company in health tech, the reality of it, well, the arguable reality of it, or at least the perception of it to a lot of entrepreneurs, is that you have to raise a lot of money. That's the initial thing. You got to raise a lot of money, and that's to get over regulatory hurdles. It's to get over product development hurdles, and it's to set you up for, I don't know, marketing globally and all these things to sell it lots. Because of course, if you raise a lot of money from VCs, they are expecting an enormous exit, therefore enormous scale. So if you raise lots of money, you need to get lots of scale. Similarly, if you raise not a lot of money, you don't need to get lots of scale necessarily. And so there's sort of like a mismatch here, because I've talked about this before I did a big LinkedIn post on this, that healthcare is so often a local game that you should be able to develop local solutions to local problems. The problem with that, though, is that seemingly you need to raise loads of money to just get something to market. And so I just wonder if it's the responsibility of our sector to reduce the amount of money that is required to get something to market, so that there isn't the same pressure on scale. Because what I see is quite a lot of products coming to market and solving a problem in one area. We see it all the time. Pilotitis in the NHS, things get piloted. You might get one contract. You get lots of people feeling benefit from that one thing, and then the struggle of scale for lots of different reasons, the fragmented nature, the difficulties in something, But the problem is that everyone has to go and get VC money, and the venture capital model is that you need to get this massive 100x, 1000x return on the money. And so there's always this pressure on doubling revenues year on year on year on year on year. And so people are chasing that. And yeah, of course, then when there's a market where, okay, limited partners, the people who invest in VCs, LPs are not investing in VC as an asset class because it's just too risky. There's just not enough capital sloshing about in the space. So people stop investing in VC. Those funds don't exist. All of a sudden now, these people, these entrepreneurs, these startups that are going around looking for cash can't get it at the VC type of scale. So now there's this dearth in ideas, or ideas coming to reality. So there's something about the costs of coming to market, but perhaps there's just something about the mindset of entrepreneurship and building a company in health tech that, you speak to someone like Harry Lykostratis from Open Medical, the founder and CEO of Open Medical, bootstrapped a tech company, has taken no investment whatsoever, and has reached pretty mind-blowing scale with the NHS as a customer, by the way, in the UK. It is possible. It is possible to raise a small round, focus on a tech product, which by definition, by the way, if you've got a software product, you're going to be running pretty high gross margins. And yes, I understand you need to hire a dev team to, update and often develop and lots of different things, depending on when you're raising that money to build a product or just to maintain it or whatever. But I don't know, Harry's got a model there where you can bootstrap a tech company. Now, if you want to raise the money to beat out competition, or you want to raise the money to get rapid scale because it's something that you need to see everywhere, great. But I don't know, I'm just wondering in my mind whether this is showing a weakness, because if health tech can't cope with a difficult market for investment, then this isn't the first or the last time this is going to happen. And so where's the backup? Where are the funding mechanisms to get over this hurdle? Things like Innovate UK are great for this, by the way, if you can get the money for Innovate UK. Because of course that's non-dilutive, funding that's not dilutive. It's non-equity funding. So you literally just granted money and you go and do a thing. And so those can help with getting over those early hurdles, and that is a great model. And stuff. So I just wonder if there needs to be more of a conversation about this sort of thing now. And yeah, it's easy to talk about the doom and gloom. Like, it is doom and gloom. Like, yeah, okay, these startups aren't existing, blah, 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 blah. But I don't know. I mean, I'm simultaneously interested in who is doing well right now and what are they doing, because I think that would tell a fascinating story. The best companies do come out of times like this, so certain people say. So yeah, where's the health tech company that's thriving rather than just surviving?
It's like the thing they say about the holes in an aeroplane, and everyone's like, where are the holes? We need to patch them. It's like, no, the bits we learn from are the bits that didn't get hit, didn't get holes. They're the bits that are held up. And that's what we need to find, the bits that haven't been shot down in this kind of ongoing environment. I think, James, the stuff you speak to is a trend that I don't think it's entirely health tech. I think health tech have been sort of caught up in the tailwinds of the tech sector more generally, and it's this trend towards hyper growth, often at all costs. And startup founders who have brilliant ideas get whisked out to San Francisco, and they see all these tech companies who've raised millions in these beautiful shiny offices, and it's growth, growth, growth. And that is now the model and the mechanism through which people think they need to grow a company. And that's why we end up in positions like this article says, where we have companies sort of doing mass redundancies and things, because actually they've grown. And it's not just a case of scaling up to reach patients, but it's also company growth, because that's what's expected from investors. That's what's needed to hit the milestones that they've got. But it's just sort of, it's being framed in the wrong way. And you're right, healthcare, health tech, it is far more local than that. You're not an app that's going to gain global dominance out of one place, and you're not going to be the Deliveroo of whatever. And companies bloat and become inefficient as a result of that, which is why bootstrapping and raising small rounds makes more sense. Like, work out where you actually need that support and that resource, raise for it, absolutely, if you need to. Get in really smart people, have a really smart and savvy business plan. But the second you bring lots of people in, there's disconnectedness in companies. And I think it's a much bigger problem than health tech. But I think we're all guilty of looking at the nice, shiny things and saying, I'd like that for my company, of course. Of course, I want the nice office with the ping pong table. And I want investors to woo me. And I feel good because I've managed to raise all this money. What an achievement. And it is an achievement. But actually, fundamentally from a business, what are the smaller steps you need to hit your business goals? And let's focus on them rather than the exit 10 years down the line, and growing for that now when it's probably a bit too premature.
It's interesting you mentioned bloating as well, because I think traditionally what we've seen is people raising big sums of money and massively scaling their team. And yes, the big shiny offices too, but lots and lots of hires very, very quickly. But actually, certainly in the last 6 months, even if you look at some of those unicorn valuations with recent raises we've seen, those big raises have been immediately followed by huge restructures and large-scale redundancies. And I think that also investors are becoming probably more astute to exactly the point that you make, which is that actually you need to be able to scale, but you have to be able to do it efficiently. And that even those big raises we're seeing are coming with quite potentially, and I don't know because I haven't seen, draconian terms attached to them, which is around efficiency as much as it is around scale. Because the number of times we've now seen it, a pattern is starting to emerge. So actually, I think those big, not even big raises, but those raises aren't necessarily symbolic of massive team growth, but the expectation on the scale is still there. And I think also one of the big challenges we've seen is, particularly for early stage companies, being able to raise money, where venture capital have struggled to raise their own funds. And I think we've seen some more new funds come through, and second, third funds being raised as well from venture capital. But that's been an incredibly difficult and slow time, because they're not getting the money down from the LPs. And what that has resulted in is that the criteria that they are putting to early, even if you look at pre-seed and seed stage companies, is so out of reach that those companies aren't receiving capital, and the capital that they have got in reserve, where usually they'd be funding a much bigger number of companies, is actually being held in reserve as follow-on funding to keep their existing portfolio alive for longer and give them more runway, so that they stand a better chance of getting returns from their existing cohort, rather than spreading their risk amongst a bigger group of companies. And so I think that in part is also been one of the reasons why we've seen this almost strangulation of innovation, and this dearth of very early stage companies really struggling to get off the ground, because that capital just hasn't been there, because those slightly more, and not massively more, but slightly more advanced companies are receiving that capital probably with less favourable terms, let's not forget, than they would be wanting, but as follow-on funding from their existing existing investors, again with these difficult terms of having to lay off staff and make hard decisions. I don't necessarily think that actually raising money, like, there's a lot of difficult stuff that is coming with that at the moment. I think having money in your pocket, because people are going to be harder on you, and you're going to be under much more scrutiny.
Yeah, I listened to a webinar ages ago about funding for biotech companies, and they said typically over the last 10, 20 years or so, funding has been to get you to the point of clinical trial. But actually now companies are having to look out further and say, well, one funding round needs to get you beyond that clinical trial, because it needs to support you during the period where you're raising your next round. And obviously up to clinical trial, that's where all your efforts are, of course. It's, such a pivotal moment in the lifespan of a biotech company. But where are you going to give yourself the time to then raise the money you need to do the next bit? And so it's making sure you give yourself that extra time as a company and as a leader to then support that next phase. And that's how kind of investors are having to approach that now, and work, with potentially first-time CEOs or, different stages, of course, of experience and scale, and support them through all of it, rather than just, look, this is your big milestone, which you need to hit. Let's throw everything at it. We get to it. We're a success. And then it's like, actually, the money's run out. And how do we do the next bit? So I think that's kind of fascinating.
There's also a bit around like what your competition is doing as well. And therefore, like, what is the culture of raising money to build a product and send it out? Because if you've got, let's say you're skinning ChatGPT for some generative AI thing, and your idea is, well, I'm going to sell the product at a profitable rate. It's going to be really low costs to develop, but I'll sell it profitably because whatever they pay me will go towards the back end of ChatGPT, and blah blah blah, and per query, like, I'll just make a few pence profit each time. It'll be fine. Problem is then, if your three closest competitors have just raised 100 million and are giving everyone that same thing for free, or indeed like even better than free, because it's going to do even more stuff, or like whatever it is, there's then just this race to like, just how much can you give away for free, or how much can you drop the price, just a race to the bottom. And so the person that wants to actually build it sustainably to solve a local problem is going to get like completely not used, because the bigger, more generic model that's going to be for everyone that needs to now do global scale because they've raised the VC money is going to win because they're going to use that for free. And then when the bubble does burst, it's now just burst for those others too that were trying to bootstrap it and do it profitably. So there's a thing clearly about the culture of it as well, which is just making it very difficult because what chance have you got if you're trying to bootstrap a tech company when your closest competitors raise loads of money and is just providing a much better deal than you? It's like I remember seeing in that WeWork dramatization that the part, I don't know how true it is, but the part where like, you know, SoftBank was just like pouring money into it, and he was just standing outside other co-working spaces, just telling people that were coming out, like, you know, bin your contract here, just come to WeWork, and I'll just give you 6 months free or a year free, or like all that sort of stuff. It's like, well, if that's your competition, WeWork also famously ended super well. So like, you know, like. But this is what's happening, particularly around these generative AI models. People are just raising so much money and just pouring it straight into NVIDIA chips, and like, NVIDIA's just sat there laughing. But like, yeah, and the consumer's getting it for free, the customer's getting it for free, pretty much, or heavily subsidized. And so, interesting, isn't it?
It is. And look, I feel like we have talked the ear off our audience for the last hour. Hopefully there's some value in there for our listeners. I think there is. I think we've covered a lot of ground on that, on AI and predicting diabetes, whether or not actually a person in a room for an hour might be a better alternative, and also where, you know, we need to see some mindset shift around raising money, what that means, both from the funder perspective, but also from the entrepreneur perspective. However, I think let's close out with some hopefully well-placed optimism. It is my final episode for the year, so I am going to say see you in 2025 and speak into reality, some positivity, some easier, less painful fundraisers, a real boost for, I think, the ecosystem, and ultimately something that we're all working for, which is just creating impact and making change for the people who all of these technologies, innovations, initiatives, programs exist to help. So that's my parting gift to you all. Thanks for tolerating me over the last 12 months as my brain has ceased to function and grown a small human. But I'll see everyone on the other side, and I'll leave you guys to steal the show.
That won't happen, of course.
It will. It'll be far more coherent and far more interesting. So with that, have another good week, and we will be back as usual next week with the Healthtech news.